This is Nikki Toyama-Szeto. I'm the Executive Director of Christians for Social Action and your host for this episode of 20 Minute Takes. Today, we're joined by Dr. Carolyn Chen. She's a professor at UC Berkeley, the co-director of the Berkeley Center for Study of Religion, and the author of Work, Pray, Code, When Work Becomes Religion in Silicon Valley. We talk today about work and faith and the ways that spiritual practices are spilling over into the workplace. We talk about the effect that has on our public spaces, as well as what it means to be people who can talk about religion in ways that build bridges and promote dialogue. Join us for today's conversation. Dr. Carolyn Chen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Nikki. So happy to be here.
So as I look at your professional story or your CV, I see that you've touched multiple universities, Brown University, Northwestern, and near Chicago, and then UC Berkeley now where you are. So you've got kind of that East Coast, Midwest, West Coast. Where in the country do you feel most at home or most able to kind of fully be yourself and show up how you like to show up?
Oh, that's such a great question, Nikki. I think it has to be California.
Oh, yeah.
I grew up in California, and I grew up in Southern California, but
it's a totally different state than the one you're in now.
Exactly. But I've chosen to make Northern California my home. But I feel and really they feel so, they're such different places, but I feel really equally at home in both Southern and Northern California. But that being said, I also, the place that I've lived the longest, like in any one place, if we don't count California, Northern and Southern California separately, is actually the Midwest. When I was teaching at Northwestern, and really, I just grew to love the city of Chicago and kind of the Midwestern hospitality and the seasons. So I think, oh gosh, a little bit of everything.
I've spent time in many of the similar places, and my hometown is Evanston. So
it is
that 1 week of spring, that 1 week of fall. Oh, it's beautiful. But those winters.
You're from Evanston. What, you grew up in Evanston?
I grew up in Evanston, and then it snowed in April. So that's when I just had to go west for college. So.
Okay. Yes. I mean, the winters were really a little long and hard to take, but I love Evanston. It's a fantastic one, just such a wonderful. There's so many things I miss about it.
Yeah, it's a great town. One of the things that we try to do here with Christians for Social Action is we're trying to stir the imagination, what Christian faithfulness looks like in new ways. And I think one of the things I'm particularly interested to hear your thoughts about are, where are you seeing spirituality show up in places that are outside of the church?
Yeah. So I think, if I, just because I wrote a book about spirituality in the workplace, I can start there. In my book, Work, Pray, Code, I talk about Work, Pray, Code, When Work Becomes Religion in Silicon Valley. I talk about how tech companies are using religion and spirituality to make their workers more productive in tech firms. And so I see it really showing up there. It's something that is being actively promoted by companies, for instance, by bringing meditation and mindfulness practices into the companies, by bringing in religious and spiritual leaders to give inspirational talks, by importing sort of a lot of religious and spiritual language. The ways that people describe work these days, they use this language, calling, mission, passion, purpose, authenticity. These are deeply spiritual words that we at one time really were reserved for the sphere of religion and spirituality. And now we're seeing this in these workspaces in companies and corporations. I think that there's also, so not only are companies actively promoting spirituality because, very frankly, it feeds their bottom line, but I think that also workers are looking for meaning and purpose and fulfillment in work. The ways that we think about work have really shifted, I would say, in the last 40 and 50 years, so that work is no longer just a place where work is no longer just a thing that you're doing to, bring home the bacon, right? But it's a place where you are expecting to find meaning and purpose and fulfillment and even identity and belonging. Again, these are the kinds of things that Americans 60, 70 years ago were looking to their faith communities and other civic organizations to fulfill.
Well, and why do you think that shift has happened? Why is there that engagement with these different areas? Maybe one might say beyond the bounds of what normally folks would think of in terms of the expectations they would have from a job.
Yeah, so it's a complicated answer, but I'll try to make it simple. I would date this transition, this transformation happening to about 40, 50 years ago. This is like in the late 70s and 80s. Here you have really the restructuring of the global economy, the rise of global capitalism, the shift in the United States from an industrial to a post-industrial, specifically a knowledge economy in the United States. And what we see happening during this time, was really, really fascinating in the world of work, is that high-skilled workers, or we could also call them professional workers, started increasing the number of hours that they were working. So these are the workers who actually can afford to work the least, are actually choosing to work more. And this has to do a lot with the shifts in work culture itself, so that firms, in order to compete in this new global economy, really needed to get more hours. They needed their workers to be more productive. So they looked towards changing their own workplace culture. So they did certain things. And I'm really speaking about corporations and professional workers, but they changed the incentive structures, they flattened the hierarchies, they actually increased the pay of high-skilled workers, but they also intentionally made work more meaningful in order to align the deepest parts of a worker's soul, of a self, with their work. Because when that happens, companies, they give anything to their work, right? So we start seeing this. So I locate this shift to really these larger structural forces, but then we see these kind of intermediary institutions, which are workplaces, really shifting and talking about work differently and structuring their work differently, so that instead they start to think about the workplace as a community that should be giving you a sense of belonging, that you start having these, it's no longer you just go to work from 9 to 5 and then find spaces for fulfillment outside of work. No, well, now, particularly in tech companies, I would say the sort of perfect example of this, prototypical example of this, is tech companies in the 2010s, before the pandemic, where they were basically meeting your every need. And this is when I went into tech companies and I talked to human resources professionals. They talked about nurturing the souls of their employees and fulfilling the needs of both their mind, body, and spirit. So thinking about the company as being this holistic space, I think that what has changed is that we are used to talking about and thinking about work as extractive, and that sort of kind of comes at that term that we use, work-life balance, as if life were one thing and work were another, and that work is taking from our life. That's sort of the traditional way that we talk about work. But I think that something has shifted, particularly for high-skilled work. This is for educated workers, that work is providing so much for us. It's work giving us a sense of meaning and purpose, that we really have to think about work as having an attractive force on us instead, that it's actually meeting and fulfilling many of our needs. And so a lot of these, anyways, so a lot of these changes have happened, I would say, in really the last 40 years. So on one side of the story is what's happening in the sphere of work, but also what's been happening in the sphere of religion and institutions outside of work is really this precipitous decline. So in the last, 70 years, we've seen this slow decline in religious participation, religious affiliation, so that today the fastest growing religious group are actually religious nuns. So that's NONES. But we need to think about the decline of religion not as just a story about religion, but it's in large scale about the decline of civic participation in America in total. And so that people are actually disengaging from the public, disengaging from civic associations. And so that if this was the area where Americans in the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s, used to find a sense of identity, belonging, purpose, and meaning. Well, what happens when you have the impoverishment of that and the absence of that? And instead, you have these companies growing stronger and stronger, demanding more time and energy from their workers, but also giving more, providing more for their, not only no longer just for their material needs, but for their social and increasingly their spiritual needs.
Mm-hmm. I see. So we're seeing this decline at one point, and also kind of this emergence that's coming, particularly for the highly skilled workers.
Exactly. And so that's what I call this trend of the expansion of work and the decline of religion that we've seen in the last 40 years. The expansion of work in sort of taking care of more and more areas of your life,
Mm-hmm.
and the decline of religion in people's lives, and also as a social presence.
And then I know that your book was really focusing on tech workers in Silicon Valley.
Mm-hmm.
It also sounds like this nurturing of the whole person or the spiritual side is not necessarily happening among Amazon warehouse workers, for example. Would that be accurate to say?
Yes, that is absolutely, yeah, you're absolutely right. So when we think about the story of work in the United States in the last 40 years, what we see is this sort of divergence where you have high skilled workers, these are educated workers, where work is becoming increasingly more rewarding. They are actually getting paid better than they did before. And it's becoming more meaningful. It's becoming more fulfilling than it has ever before. But then you also have this other path of workers, and these are workers who are not college educated and who are taking low skilled jobs. And for them, they're actually working less. They actually have fewer jobs. Their work, they're being paid less, and their work is becoming less dignified and less meaningful, less stable and less secure. So that's the story for them. And so we really have this diverging experience of work. And I should just back up and say that the workers that I talk about in my book are really a small percentage of American workers. They're part of this elite workforce.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. But I would also describe, but increasingly their experience is, I think, that of most educated, professional skilled workers in the United States.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I thought one of the things that your book brought to conclusion that I thought was so compelling is you talked about how the workplace for these tech workers, aspired to meet all of these different needs. It was deeply engaging and trying to, I think, connect them to something that was more existential, like a higher calling of some sort. And that even as it was investing in the individual, that people were discovering personal wholeness. Or I think you called it private wholeness, but public brokenness. Did I say that correctly?
Yes. This is when I sort of talk about the social costs of this kind of wholeness. Yeah.
So can you unpack that a little bit for us of what, as a sociologist, that you were seeing, that dynamic that was happening?
Yeah. So, one of the questions that I get, one of the most common questions that I get with this book is like, what's wrong? What's wrong with this? Like, first, what we see is that these workers who they actually become spiritual because they're part of the workplace, because work is essentially making spirituality accessible and also profitable. Do you see? They're being sort of handed it to them. And they talk about leading very fulfilling and happy lives. And so a lot of times it's like, well, what's to complain about this? The companies are becoming more profitable. People are living happier. They're eating really well. They're healthier, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the problem that I see as a sociologist is that, first of all, we have to understand is that, these are elite workspaces. That really only a minority of Americans get to participate in or get to benefit from. But in the larger scale, what's happening is that these companies, work is demanding so much time and energy and devotion, and it's providing and meeting so many of their needs that workers in these companies are disengaging from the public. They essentially don't need the public anymore. So the phrase that you were referring to is, I was referring to this idea of techtopia, which I develop in the book. And techtopia is a society where work becomes the highest source of fulfillment. And I talk about, Silicon Valley as being a techtopia, but that it is also a harbinger for so many, for knowledge industry hubs in the United States, places like Cambridge, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., where you live. And so that what happens is that, again, work monopolizes so much of people's time and energy and devotion that the public becomes impoverished. So let me just give you an example here. One Buddhist priest that I spoke to told me that the members of his Zendo didn't have time to come to the morning sittings anymore, the morning meditations anymore, because they were so busy working. So he had this great idea, which was that he would bring meditation to the workplace. But in the process of bringing meditation to the workplace, he needs to strip it of its ethical teachings, right? Because he needs to then repackage meditation as a productivity practice. And so what happens in techtopias is that the workplace acts like this big, huge, powerful magnet that attracts the time and energy and devotion of the community, so that there isn't very much for any of the other institutions, such as families, faith communities, arts organizations, and that any of these other smaller and weaker institutions, in order to survive, they essentially need to meet the needs of the large alpha institution, the workplace, which is the case of this Buddhist temple. In order to survive, he needs to make meditation useful to work, right? Bring it to work, incorporate it into the workplace, make it into a work practice. So what this does, again, is not only it impoverishes our public sphere, it weakens all other civic institutions, and it provides us with, I think, a very impoverished sense of ethics, of meaning and purpose in the world, because we get our sense of meaning and belonging and purpose from the institutions we belong to. Mm-hmm. And so if in this particular kind of techtopian ecosystem, the strongest institution is the workplace, well, then the workplace and its needs, its meanings, its spirituality, its teleology dominates. And our lives become oriented around that. And I think that what I, try to do in the book is describe a reality that I think has increasingly become the reality for most people who live in knowledge industry hubs like Silicon Valley. However, we've gotten so used to it that it is like the air we breathe, the water we swim in, that we don't even have a name for it. And we've simply accepted it just as the way things should be, right?
Yeah.
And instead of resisting it, instead we find ways to accommodate to it. So here you see a lot of churches in the Bay Area, Christian ministries in the Bay Area, like, well, how can we create a workplace ministry?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's where people's energies
Meet
are.
people where they are.
Meet people
Right,
where they
they're
are.
usually saying. Uh-huh.
Exactly. Well, now on one level, like if your ultimate goal is like increasing your ministry size, then maybe that's the right thing to do. But there are costs to that.
Yeah.
One pastor that I talked to who did that, he said that, in these tech companies, if you, and when you have these workplace ministries,
Mm-hmm.
is that, well, the bus drivers, the cafeteria workers, they don't have time to come to the Bible study
Oh, interesting.
because they're paid by the hour. They're not salaried workers. They're not
Uh-huh.
being paid to be whole and fulfilled at work, you
Uh-huh.
see? And so it creates like this caste system at work. And so what it ends up being treated as is that Bible study or prayer meetings are kind of like perks
Yeah. Wow.
of the workplace.
Uh-huh.
And we have to kind of think about, well, what are the consequences of that? In fact, a lot of companies now, corporations are sort of all of a sudden being like, hey, we need to be more sensitive uh, to to religious folks and being able to help them feel like they could bring their religion into their workplace so that they can feel comfortable here. And what they tell me, this is from the corporation side of things. They say, well, they need to do this because religious folks can't bring their whole selves to the workplace unless they also feel comfortable bringing their religion and spirituality. But you have to remember that for companies, their primary goal is to increase the bottom line. So getting your whole self means, how can I get your full effort, your full hours? And if it means that I can provide a Bible study for you here, sure, we'll bring a Bible study here or a prayer meeting, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, that's fascinating. Do you, as I reflect on some of the concepts that you're introducing, I'm also mindful of the fact that there has been a huge shift in that area of the world. And I would say that faith communities have sort of a different covenant or relationship with their people. And ultimately, these companies are business companies, and they sometimes have to make business decisions. So as we're talking about, like, ways of creating full engagement of employees and kind of having this holistic engagement. And then I also read headlines of tens of thousands of people being laid off. Do you have any thoughts about how that might be happening in sort of a different way or experienced in a different way? I think it's maybe more I'm tossing out. There's a little bit of a contrast. I would love any of your thoughts or reflections on that.
Sure. Yeah. I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah. So, in my book, I talk about companies in Silicon Valley that companies of workplaces have become the new faith communities and knowledge industry hubs. That it's no longer, in faith communities where people are finding identity and belonging and purpose. It's actually in their companies. And I think that, companies have really borrowed from so many of the practices of faith communities because it's in these private spaces where there's no bounds to your loyalty. There's no bounds, right? It's boundless, and so workplaces have really imported many of the practices and the languages, in the language of religions, and so the world of work has been completely a roller coaster since COVID, which is pretty much like when my book came out. So it was kind of like, wow, my book came out, and then it was like the whole world of work changed. And so it's so hard. I have to tell you, Nikki, that I get these questions all the time, and I'm sort of like, I'm not really sure. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you exactly what the direction is where people are going. But I think that with with the layoffs that have happened in the last 6 months, it was a huge, rude awakening for tech workers because, the tech industry has been riding this wave, right, of of success for the last 15 years. Exactly. And it was sort of like it was invincible, like nothing could touch it. Like COVID happened, everyone else lost their work, and instead the tech industry grew and grew, right? And so it had this feeling of invincibility. And many of the people who got laid off in the last 6 months have never experienced a layoff in their life. They just never even knew that it was a possibility, right? Because of the direction that the way that the tech industry had been expanding for years. And so it was able to support sort of this myth that the company cares about you, is your family, is interested in nurturing your whole self. It was able to sort of, that that didn't the idea of a layoff just didn't seem like a reality, so talking about the family, so talking about one's coworkers as a family, like Mark Benioff of Salesforce talks about the company being ohana, like a family, right? Well, of course, you don't get laid off, you don't get fired in a family, but they were able to maintain that fiction for so long. And I really think that the last 6 months and the layoffs have, I think it was so brutal for many tech workers. And it was so interesting, especially for younger tech workers who just, older tech workers dealt with it differently. They knew some of them had been laid off in the early 2000s. They knew that was a possibility. But that younger tech workers, they had made work their life and they had bought into it. And I think that, this is a moment of reckoning. I think people are really questioning that. And tech itself has tightened its belt, and it's a different place today. It's a really different place today.
Yeah, I think that's true. To switch gears a little bit.
Sure.
I have heard that in your classes, you have managed to make a spaciousness for people to bring their faith or their spirituality into the context of, I'm going to say, academia. And the university is not always seen as being like, oh yes, please bring your, what are your Christian beliefs or whatever. It's not always seen as the most hospitable. And not only any academy, but UC Berkeley.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit of how you did, how have you fostered or created that kind of a space? I think it's really helpful for folks as we're trying to learn how to be people in a public space.
Yeah.
But also, what does that mean for us to be generously hospitable for people with similar or totally different faith views?
Yeah. Oh, thanks for that question, Nikki. It's something that, I like to talk about this and I feel pretty passionate about it. So I'm a sociologist of religion. So I teach in ethnic studies and I teach classes on Asian American religions and also race, religion, and ethnicity. And, but, I don't have to teach those classes to actually bring in religion. What I do in my classes is I always say to my students, look, in your other classes, in any class, you can talk about your race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, or class. Like any of these things you could bring into your discussions and you could talk about how it affects your perspective. Well, the one thing that's often missing is religion. And that has so deeply formed people, but it is missing in this space of in the secular university. And I always tell my students, first of all, please bring it in, because that part of your identity, that part of your experience, I want to acknowledge it, and I want to recognize that this is an important part of who you are. And please I want you to bring it actively into this classroom to talk about how it has formed you. And we all bring it in, right? So people are coming from many, many different faith traditions. So I first just sort of say, like, please, this is, I want to recognize that you normally you don't feel comfortable doing this. And I want you to ask why, think about that, and then bring it into the classroom. And then when students do that, it's like, I think that when one person has the courage to do that, it really, really opens up the space. I mean, most of the students that I teach are students of color because I teach in ethnic studies. And one of the things is that the majority of them come from a religious background. And religion is actually really important to their families, really important to their communities. And they start to learn through my classes that they have no way of speaking about it. They have not learned a way to speak about it publicly or in a secular environment. And that they have also, and they actually don't even know how to think about it intellectually either. And so I try to just provide them with those tools, but most importantly, create a space for them to talk about. That's not church, but that's also not a space where, that sometimes where it has to be about like religion bashing, just kind of a more neutral, open space. And so that's been really gratifying. I think that the majority of students have some kind of faith background. However, the majority of students are not practicing. But even if they aren't practicing, does that mean that they don't have religion in their lives or that religion doesn't form them? No, absolutely not. So how do we talk about that? And also, how do you talk about ethnicity without talking about religion for most groups, right?
Yeah.
So, so I try to point this out. It opens something in my students. I always learn something from them.
I love that. I wish our whole society could go through your class and learn just that we could speak about and share, because I think there is a way that it's an invisible force that we are all interacting with that sometimes gets unspoken. So
it's absolutely invisible. And in a place like UC Berkeley, it is actively suppressed. And people they don't have a vocabulary for speaking about religion. Yeah.
Well, thank you for all that you do. And thank you so much, Professor Carolyn Chen, for taking some time to talk with us here on 20 Minute Takes.
I'm delighted, Nikki. Thank you.
"20 Minute Takes" is a production of Christians for Social Action. We're produced and edited by David DeLeon. I'm your host, Nikki Toyama-Szeto, and the music is done by Andre Henry. You can find us on the web at christiansforsocialaction.org. Give us 5 stars, write a review, and share about the podcast with your friends.